Hi, I'm Madison and I will be discussing the jazz poetry era. In the 1920s, music and poetry collided and created jazz poetry. It immediately became a popular form of expressing yourself. Jazz poetry is a literary genre defined as poetry necessarily informed by jazz music. That is, poetry in which the poet responds to and writes about jazz. Jazz poetry, like the music itself, encompasses a variety of forms, rhythms, and sounds. During the rise of this genre of poetry, the Harlem Renaissance was taking off. Starting in the 1920s through 1930s, the Harlem Renaissance was a period filled with creative and artistic motives, shown through writing or art. The motivators who started this movement were Langston Hughes, Rudolph Fisher, Wallace Thurman, Jessie Redmond Fawcett, Nella Larsen, and more. The Renaissance focused mainly on the lives of African American people, what their life was like, their living conditions, and their concerns or thoughts about equality. African Americans expressed their personal stories or feelings through the jazz poetry. Kenneth Rexroth was born on December 22 in 1905 in South Bend, Indiana. He began publishing in magazines at the age of 15. He laid the groundwork for what later became known as the San Francisco Renaissance. He was introduced to a more musical method and then performed his poems with jazz musicians. His famous poem is called Giktahar. Yusuf Komonyaka was born April 29 in 1941 in Bogalusa, LA. He was a scholar, professor, and prize-winning poet. His poems are related to his life. Because his poems are related to his life, he tends to write in a jazz style. One of his famous poems is called After Summer Fell Apart. Langston Hughes was born on February 1st in 1902 in Joplin, Missouri. He was first recognized as an important figure in the Harlem Renaissance. He recorded the nuances of the Black life and the frustrations that occurred. Because of this, he got into jazz poetry. One of his famous poems is called The Ballad of the Landlord.
Ballad of the Landlord. Landlord, landlord, my roof has sprung a leak. Don't you remember I told you about it way last week? Landlord, landlord, these steps is broken down. When you come up yourself, it's a wonder you don't fall down. $10 you say I owe you? $10 you say is due? Well, that's $10 more than I'll pay you till you fix this house up new. What? You gonna get eviction orders? You gonna cut off my heat? You gonna take my furniture and throw it in the street? You talking high and mighty. Talk on till you get through. You ain't gonna be able to say a word if I land my fist on you. Police! Police! Come and get this man. He's trying to ruin the government and overturn the land. Copper's whistle, patrol bell, arrest. Precinct station, iron cell, headlines in press. Man threatens landlord. Tenant held no bail. Judge gives Negro 90 days in county jail.
The type of poem is a ballad. The poem is about a man who is having a difficult time paying his rent, and his landlord is demanding money. The speaker has asked his landlord to help fix the problems with his house, but the landlord has ignored his request. The speaker feels that his landlord is the criminal, but if the justice system was involved, it would be his fault. The speaker also feels that there is no constitutional justification in his condition. While reading this poem, you can imagine the man complaining about his landlord, and you can hear the noises of some specific words. For example, patrol bell, arrest, precinct station, iron cell, lines 25 through 29. In this stanza, you can imagine the patrol bell ringing and the iron cell closing. In this poem, the speaker is a middle-aged man. His voice sounds rough and exhausted. He's speaking to his landlord. He is complaining about having to pay $10 for rent when his house is falling apart and the landlord will not do anything about it. This is taking place somewhere in the United States, Harlem, New York, and the time period is the 1920s through 1930s. The motivation for the speaker to speak about this is because he believes that it is a problem and the situation is unfair and needs to be talked about. The subject is rent/landlord, and the theme is struggle in society. In 1929, the Great Depression began and the jazz poetry era ended. After the stock market crash of October in 1929, the people of Wall Street were in trouble. Millions of investors were now wiped of much of their money. The banks had failed and the money had been used up. The unemployment rate for American workers had increased. 13 to 15 million workers became unemployed. After many years of the ongoing depressed states, the Great Depression finally ended in 1939 when World War II became the new topic to handle.